Hello ladies and gentlemen, the following review for Crash Bandicoot is part 1 of a 4-part series. I will be covering Crash Bandicoot, Crash 2, Crash 3 Warped, and Crash Team Racing. This video will contain spoilers for the entire game, and it is recommended to play the game before watching this video if possible, as well as to watch these videos in proper order. This review for Crash Bandicoot, originally released on 1996 on the PlayStation 1, was conducted with a digital copy on the PlayStation 3 in 2015. Crash Bandicoot is a 3D platformer set on a trio of islands southeast of Australia, where Crash is set against the evil scientist Dr. Neo Cortex. Naughty Dog saw fit not to force the player to watch over the intro cinematic, instead opting to let someone jump in right away and begin the game. Although I can appreciate this aspect for players who have already completed Crash Bandicoot, I can understand why the first time playing you aren't given the cutscene. The only way to watch the intro cutscene is to wait at the start menu for a few moments and then it loads. It's possible, and I'd argue very likely, that new players will miss this entirely and set off on the game without any context behind what they're actually trying to achieve. Although, like Mario games, Crash games never seem to be too interested in their own plot, it is a small oversight that is easily remedied. A better solution would be to prompt the cutscene on a new game with no previous save files on memory cards, and afterwards only have it after waiting in the menu, or possibly in the options menu. This way, new players are given the intro cutscene, while old players would be able to skip it immediately. In the very first level of the game, players are given a large area to practice the controls, a wall towards the bottom of the screen, and a straight path upwards. Without dialogue, or any other indication, the level design alone here directs players in a few small ways. First, a player is directed up, and is naturally inclined to progress forward. I know this may seem trite, but given that this was quite possibly the first time a player may have played a 3D platformer, this simple setup is necessary. The area you are given lets you acclimate yourself to the controls with no threat of death. It's a smart choice, rather than throwing an enemy or a pitfall at the player right away. You're given a chance to breathe first. The first enemy you see is also the easiest enemy, and a very well designed one. The crab has a very readable, predictable, and non-threatening movement pattern, simply moving from side to side, so you can immediately predict, with as much time as you need, where the enemy is going to be. Taking into consideration that the player very understandably doesn't know how to do the spin attack yet, because of the snapping claws in front of the crab, it's clear that you cannot just touch the enemy from the front, you have to jump over it, or move around it. The crab also has a very flat and round body, which naturally draws the eye, and you can safely assume it's a place you are allowed to jump on. This simple enemy choice and its simple design is a fantastic one to start the player off getting used to dealing with obstacles. However, when we look at the first time the player is required to jump over a pit, the game's intro doesn't fare as well. Up to this brief moment, you are never required to jump, so let's assume the player doesn't know how. Again, only as to move around, which has been the only thing required thus far. The first jump is a pit of death, one which if you fall into, you lose a life. The extremely ironic thing here is a better solution for the required first jump is placed right after the pit in the form of a column lying on the ground. I don't understand why Naughty Dog would have placed these two objects next to each other in this order, other than to use the pit as a way to teach an unknowing player that they have lives. Although arguable that this is the case, it's still the lesser of two solutions. Having the column on the ground first would inform players of Crash's jump height, trajectory, and how to control Crash in the air, all before giving the player the same requirement with the punishment of losing a life should they fail. That is to say, a better solution is to teach before requiring, don't require as you teach. As it is now, these two jumps are completely reversed to how they should be. The rest of the level plays out in a similar manner, having slightly different enemy types and jumps required. Still, you are not required during level 1 to use a spin attack. So for the purpose of this review, and to accentuate an example later, we will assume the player never experiments further. Now, however, it is a good time to go over the world setup. And after completing a level, you are greeted once again to an overview of the first island. I like this layout because it gives a sense of world building and progression as you complete levels. a place in the game you are currently, and a place, even though you don't see it right away, that you can progress to. Rather than a simple hub world, or going from world 1-1 to 1-2 to 2-1, as you might in the original Super Mario Bros., for example. Comparing it to another Nintendo game, the setup is much like the setup seen in Donkey Kong Country. Although it is somewhat unfair to compare the two games, let's compare Super Mario 64's Overworld and Peach's Castle to Crash's Islands. In this comparison, Crash Bandicoot fails, where the overworld in Mario 64 is a natural extension of the game and it is itself fun to navigate. The island setup in Crash is anything but. Although it's a compelling setup, at the same time it could have been much better. Looking at Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot side by side, Crash's level progression feels like a compromise. In Super Mario 64, you are given a playground to practice Mario's movements before going to the first painting. Crash could have used a similar setup, where you have a sort of free reign of the island and going into warp stones to tackle individual levels, while having the next island progression blocked by collecting gems. But just because Super Mario 64 handles level selection better than Crash, doesn't mean Crash necessarily handles it poorly. But I'd argue that if there's an optimal scenario to handing 3D platformers over worlds, it isn't Crash's. And Crash can take steps to improve in the direction of Super Mario 64. On to level 2. We finally come across a scenario where the developers saw fit to incorporate the spin attack. They once again did it in a very safe and controlled manner. Rather than throw an enemy at you that you have to attack, or make a complex jump that requires a spin in the middle of the arc on the landing, you are simply greeted with a wall of boxes. It's also equally as possible that the player has never once jumped on a box up until this point either, although highly unlikely. At the end of each level is a box destroyed counter, so you would have at the very least been given a clue that the boxes are something you can destroy. So we know that the boxes are supposed to be tallied at the end. How do we collect them? The obvious answer is to jump on them. Again, context clues like a giant arrow pointing up on the box leads me to once again argue that the player probably would have destroyed some. However, since we are going to continue to assume that it hasn't been done yet, and rightfully so, Naughty Dog has made this assumption as well. To ensure that a player understands that boxes can be destroyed, and to ensure that a player knows how to do the spin attack, at this point at level 2, it is required to destroy them by getting past a wall of boxes. It's important to note that you cannot jump over the boxes, you cannot move around them, but they have to be spin attacked. Again, this may seem simple and obvious, but this idea is equally important to teach the player without stopping veterans from progressing with verbose tutorial levels. Naughty Dog handles this aspect of games very well. The game also features an excellent soundtrack, with a catchy main theme that is guaranteed to stick in your head much like the character design itself. Paradoxically, nothing else is of note in the game. The enemy design or specific levels seem to blend together and do not garner any particular rewards. It's difficult to say whether this is a testament to the music and Crash's design, or a flaw in the level and enemy aesthetics, but I feel as though there should be at least 1 or 2 set piece levels that you remember. Again, Crash is a very recognizable character. He has an iconic look and style. However, I'd argue this doesn't really matter much, as it has almost nothing to do with the game itself. Even if you replace Crash Bandicoot with Mario or Sonic or a purple box without animations, the mechanics and other aspects of the game are much more important than the design of the character. The impact Crash had outside the game shouldn't affect the perception of the game itself today. After finishing Island 2, the player will have gone through a normal level, a side-scrolling level, a level where the objective is to ascend, a level where you are being chased towards the bottom of the screen, a level where you ride an animal and the game is on an auto-run path, and finally a level where you are tasked with taking out an enemy, or in other words, a boss level. The small changes in gameplay have a profound effect on the variety that the game can be perceived to offer. Far from simply having one type of level, these breaks and tweaks give a sense of doing something different and keep from what could get relatively boring, fresh and exciting for the most part. It would have been nice, however, to see more variety, perhaps playing as a different character or doing things that don't involve platforming at all. I can understand the need to stick to a single genre. The hassle and overuse of tutorials to teach the player more than one game type might be asking a bit much, but the on-rails nature of Crash also means that these small differences in level types don't add up to what would really feel wholly and unique and different. For example, the same mechanics used to control and navigate level 1 are also used to navigate the first boss fight. It would have been more interesting if we could have a level where we can briefly use a power-up or new game mechanic, and then have the boss fight ask to use that power-up or mechanic to defeat him. Another disappointing lack of variety comes from the stylistic theme of each island. In grand total, Crash Bandicoot has 3 different themes: a jungle theme, a temple theme, and a machinery and technology theme. There are a few standouts, but they come few and far between. As a result, and partly due to gameplay stagnation, the game can, and I'd argue does, drag on at quite a few points. With a runtime of only 6.5 hours, this quickly becomes a problem. I found myself more interested in getting to the next boss, as they were truly the only unique thing and fun thing. The camera also poses issues with Crash Bandicoot. Although for the most part this is a non-issue, as most levels involve Crash running towards the top of the screen, and the low close angle of the camera works well for this. There are, however, some examples where the camera angle becomes problematic. In particular, the levels where Crash is tasked with running towards the screen, being chased by some object, and a few of the bosses. When running from a boulder, the camera is so close to the edge of the screen that you really need lightning quick reflexes or to have done the level before to properly platform. On top of all this, the levels in Crash also feel extremely narrow and limited. Due to the close angle of the camera and the large polygon look of Crash himself and the enemies, there isn't a lot of breathing room to navigate left and right in most levels. What this causes is a claustrophobic feeling where the player is going to feel like he can't properly navigate around enemies or objects. Mechanically, Crash feels stiff. The 2 key mechanics, jumping and moving, are tied to the D-pad. This game was made before the advent of the DualShock, and it shows. Crash just moves in an unnatural stiff motion. Part of the problem is the odd angle of the camera, once again getting in the way of platforming. It becomes difficult to properly gauge your distance and measure your next jump. This isn't as present in the side-scrolling sections. Being able to properly assess distances due to better placement of the camera alleviates this perception of the problem greatly. However, most levels have the camera behind Crash, so most levels are affected by this. Ultimately, Crash feels dated. The controls are stiff, the camera causes issues, the graphics are losing their charm, and the on-rails nature of the platformer feels incredibly constrictive compared to a modern 3D platformer. Although I would not say it's a bad game, it stands more of a museum piece to be remembered than a piece of art to be enjoyed. I wouldn't recommend someone go back and play this game lest they be an enthusiast. The impact Crash Bandicoot has had on Sony as a company and video games as a medium cannot be understated, and for that reason alone, the game is worth looking at. But Crash Bandicoot is a product of its time, and we have come a long way since then.